Evaluating quantitative journal articles. Galvan describes quantitative research articles as easy to spot because of the prevalence of statistics in these articles. Galvan presents the following aspects as key components of quantitative studies. An explicit hypothesis or research question that remains the same throughout the study. An, ideally, unbiased sample of participants who are considered fairly representative of the general population from which they are drawn. A large sample, for example, more than 30 people for an experiment. Objective measures. And statistics-based results that are thought to reflect the greater population. Quantitative research can be further categorized into experimental and non-experimental studies. In experimental research, participants receive some treatment or intervention for the purpose of the study, and their outcomes are observed. Depending on the rigor of the experimental design, researchers may be able to conclude that the treatment causes the outcome. In non-experimental studies, participants are observed as is, without any manipulation or administration of interventions. Participants may be receiving different conditions, such as after-school tutoring versus no tutoring, but this is not under the control of the researchers. In non-experimental studies, any conclusions about cause and effect are unwarranted. Nonetheless, such studies are very important for looking at the relationship between some outcome, such as academic achievement or success as a leader, and things that cannot be manipulated or controlled by a researcher, such as personality traits, background conditions, and so forth. Now let's consider the parts of a quantitative study and how to evaluate their quality. The participant section should include the number of participants, called the sample size, some information about relevant characteristics such as demographics, and an explanation of how participants were chosen for the study. In general, a larger sample size is better in quantitative studies, as the more people who participated, the more the sample will look like the overall population from which the sample was drawn. Ideally, participants will be chosen randomly from the population, but in practice this rarely happens. Participants are often selected because the researchers had access to them, for example, students in one's class, making them a convenient sample. Although non-random selection is not a major flaw of a quantitative study, it does limit the researcher's ability to say that the results obtained would likely be the results one would get if one could study the entire population, what we call generalizability. The measures or instruments section should describe each way that the researchers obtain data. This can include tests, questionnaires, observational checklists, and other strategies. Each measure should have information about its reliability and validity. Reliability is the consistency of a measure. For example, for a test of something that is relatively stable, such as personality traits, a person should get essentially the same results every time he or she takes the test, assuming that nothing about the person has changed. Similarly, if two people fill out an observational checklist for the same child at the same time, they ought to have similar impressions of the child's behavior. Validity is the accuracy of the measure. It measures what it is supposed to measure. Of course, educational and psychological measures are rarely perfectly valid. There are many things that can go into a test score after all, but they should be reasonably valid. For example, all of the items on a questionnaire about teachers' attitudes towards students with chronic illness should be about that topic. A test of pure mathematical ability should not have heavy reading demands. And a test of 5th grade general science knowledge should cover all of the topics that 5th graders learn in science, not just one or two. Note that validity is relative to the purpose of the study. A standardized science test written in English might be a highly valid measure of science knowledge for English speakers, but it would not be valid for measuring the science knowledge of a group of English language learners who have been in the United States for a single semester, for example. If the reliability or validity of the measures used is poor or not reported, this is a serious flaw in the study, as quantitative results are only as valid as the measures used to obtain them. Furthermore, stronger studies will typically include more than one measure of the outcome. For example, in a study evaluating the benefits of attention training for children with ADHD, outcomes might be measured with both the parent and the teacher version of the Connors rating scales, as well as researcher observation. there is a separate design section. This will describe the specific method of collecting data, such as survey research, correlational research, or experimental research. A key point here is in experimental research, where the researchers determine the conditions to which participants are exposed. If the individual participants are randomly assigned to conditions, for example, a treatment versus no treatment, this is a major strength. In contrast, if intact groups, such as entire classes or even entire schools, are randomly assigned to conditions, this is a limitation. The reason for this is that random assignment of individuals is considered the best way to make two groups essentially equal. That is, if half of a sample is randomly assigned to get the treatment and half of a sample is randomly assigned not to get the treatment, then, on average, the group that receives the treatment and the group that does not will be essentially the same in every other way except for the presence or absence of the treatment. Although this does not always end up being the case with small groups, with large groups it is statistically likely that the two groups will be roughly identical. In experiments with random assignment of individual participants to conditions, the researchers are warranted in concluding that a treatment causes an outcome. In contrast, in studies without random assignment of individuals, including those that are experimental and those that are not, it is impossible to rule out other explanations for why the two groups, or people in general, differ, apart from differences in the studied variables. For example, let's say a school that uses Reader's Theater is compared to a school that uses Reader's Workshop, and the results indicate that students in the school using Reader's Workshop scored higher on a reading achievement test than students in the school using Reader's Theater. Can you conclude that Reader's Workshop is better than Reader's Theater? No, because the schools might differ in other important ways that affect the students' reading achievement scores. In short, researchers should avoid causal inferences unless they have used random assignment of individuals. Similarly, if all participants receive the treatment and there is no control group, causal conclusions are not warranted, as there are many other possible explanations for why the participants might have changed over time. Such studies are still valuable for demonstrating possibilities, but they cannot be used to support cause-effect relationships. The procedure section should describe all of the steps that the researchers took to conduct the study. Insufficient detail or vague descriptions can be a serious problem. If a treatment is involved, the researchers should describe the treatment in depth or provide a reference to a source where the treatment is described in depth. The results section should include descriptive statistics, which are things like percentages of the sample who had certain outcomes, mean scores, and so forth. The results section will also typically include inferential statistics, which are statistical tests of whether the results obtained with a sample are likely or unlikely to be attained if, hypothetically speaking, there were no results in the population. Researchers provide significance tests that can be used to determine the realness of the results. However, it is possible that a result can be significant but fairly meaningless. This is because significance is heavily tied to the sample size. Thus, researchers are advised to include information about the size of the effects observed, as well as a description of the meaningfulness of the results. Significant but small or even meaningless results would be a serious limitation of a study. Finally, in the discussion section, you should note whether the researchers have accurately interpreted their results. Researchers should avoid making sweeping generalizations or overreaching in their conclusions. Clues that this might be happening include words like always and never to describe outcomes, prove, which is a major no-no for research as no study can prove anything, and unwarranted causal language. As Galvan notes, every quantitative study is flawed. Your task is to determine whether the flaws are so great that the results are worthless, or whether the results are valuable in spite of the flaws, as long as the results are considered tentative and are limited to the appropriate context.